Foied vino pipafo cra carefo. That phrase is not Latin, but if you've studied Latin before, you may have understood some or all of it. This text was inscribed about 2,300 years ago on an ancient kylix, or ceramic bowl usually used for drinking wine, about 50 kilometers north of the city of Rome. The language of this inscription is a sister language to Latin, a language that went extinct long ago, before the time even of Julius Caesar and Jesus Christ. This language is Faliscan, the closest known relative to Latin, and it is the subject of today's episode. Welcome to Jack of All Languages, the show where we travel through time and across cultures one language at a time. In today's episode, we'll hear about Faliscan, the long-lost sister language of Latin, including where it was spoken, by whom, and for how long. And then at the end of the episode, I'll show you a few example texts so you can get a feel for how the language actually sounded. But before we jump into the history of Faliscan, a quick word from today's sponsor, ITALKI. If you're interested in learning languages, ancient or modern, ITALKI is a great way to work one-on-one with teachers from across the world. You can find tutors in languages from Spanish and Italian to Latin and ancient Greek. And if you use the code in my description, you can get $10 off your first lesson on iTalki, and you'll be supporting my channel at the same time. Now, let's talk about who spoke Faliscan and where. The Faliscans lived north of Rome in the region of Latium, today Lazio. And the area they lived in was called Ager Faliscus, or Faliscan country. The main settlement where the Faliscans lived was called Falleri Veteres, or Old Falleri, and it's near the modern-day city of Civita Castellana. The Faliscans found themselves between two powerful civilizations, the Etruscans to the north and the Romans to the south. And they often allied themselves with the Etruscans against the Romans. Unfortunately for them, this did not turn out very well. The Faliscans were defeated by the Romans on numerous occasions, including in 396, 351, and 241 BC. And that last date, 241 BC, is when the Faliscans were basically defeated for good by the Romans and incorporated into Roman society. This was toward the end of the First Punic War, and the Faliscans had revolted against the Romans, and the Romans responded by squashing the uprising and destroying the city of Falleri Veteres. The Romans built a new city nearby called Falleri Novi. They relocated all the Faliscans there, and within about 100 years, the Faliscan language had pretty much gone extinct. Faliscan belongs to the Italic group within the Indo-European language family. And there was debate among scholars for a long time about where to classify Faliscan within this Italic branch. Is it a dialect of Latin? Is it more closely related to other Italic languages like Oscan and Umbrian? In their article, Is Faliscan a Local Latin Patois?, Brian Joseph and Rex Wallace run through the three traditional views about Faliscan's position relative to the rest of the Italic language family. The first view is that Faliscan forms its own subgroup within the family, so it's not in the Latin group and it's not in the Oscan-Umbrian group either. The second view, represented by this second graph, is that Faliscan is just a dialect of Latin. And the third view is that Faliscan and Latin form their own subgroup, and in fact, they are more closely related to each other than they are to any other languages. In this last view, that Faliscan and Latin are separate languages, but they form part of the same language group, is what these authors argue in favor of. And they argue this on the basis of a couple of shared innovations that Latin and Faliscan have that Oscan and Umbrian and other Italic languages don't have. These include things like the labial future tense. So in both Latin and Faliscan, you form the future tense with a labial sound, either b or f. So in Faliscan, you have pipafo, meaning I will drink, or carefo, meaning I will lack. While in Latin, you can have amabit, he or she will love, and carebo, I will lack. In Oscan and Umbrian and other Italic languages, on the other hand, you form the future using an S sound. Another shared innovation are the accusative pronouns ending in D in Latin and Faliscan. Both languages have the word med, meaning me. While in Oscan and Umbrian, the accusative pronouns are formed by adding a particle om to the end. Furthermore, they argue that Faliscan has a number of features that separate it from Latin to the extent that it shouldn't be considered a dialect of Latin. And one of these features is the voiced velar fricative from Proto-Italic, which would have sounded something like g, a kind of G sound, but with your throat a little bit more open and more air coming out. So this sound turned into two different sounds in Latin and Faliscan, and that's just one of the features they use to establish Faliscan as its own language. Now the language versus dialect question is tricky, and I've gotten into it a little bit before on this show, but I mention this right now just to establish that Faliscan is considered its own language and not a dialect. And this also boils down to the fact that Faliscan doesn't come from Latin, but rather they both descend from a common ancestor that they split off a few hundred years before most of these Faliscan texts are created. So what else do we know about Faliscan? Speakers of the common ancestor of Faliscan in Latin were probably separated from each other around the 9th or 8th century BCE when the Etruscans moved into the city of Veii. And basically what this did was it split off these two groups and their languages started diverging. And within a couple hundred years of divergent development, Latin and Faliscan had become their own languages, although there was probably still a pretty high degree of mutual intelligibility. We know that Faliscan was written in an alphabet that was adapted from the Etruscan alphabet, which itself was adapted from the Greek alphabet. And this Faliscan alphabet had 21 letters, and texts have been found that were written both right to left and left to right. About 350 to 400 Faliscan texts have been discovered, depending on who you ask, and the majority of these fit into 4 different categories. We have funerary inscriptions, things like, "Here lies so-and-so." We have votive descriptions that would have been dedicated to gods like Apollo and Ceres. We have ownership inscriptions, something like, "This pot belongs to so-and-so." And then we have official or public inscriptions, which may have had the name of a certain magistrate on them. And like I said, at the end of this episode, we'll take a look at some of these texts. Faliscan phonology was pretty similar to Latin's. It had 5 vowels, and each one of those vowels had a short and a long version. The consonants were also very similar to Latin's, with one notable difference being the preservation of certain proto-italic fricatives in the middle of words. These fricatives were the, v, and g, and in Latin these sounds turn into d, b, and g. So in the middle of a word in Faliscan you might have the sound the, where in Latin you're going to have the sound duh. In terms of morphology, Faliscan was also very similar to Latin. It had a case system with 5 cases. These are the nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative. And like Latin, there were 5 different declension patterns, or just declensions as they're usually called. And if you take a look through this chart, you can see that the case endings for Latin and Faliscan have a lot of similarities. Now I want to talk a little bit about the timeline of the Faliscan language. So I mentioned that Faliscan and Latin split off from each other at about the 8th or 9th century BC. And then by 150 BC, we know that Faliscan had pretty much fully gone extinct. So this is actually a pretty long time for a language to stick around, 600 or 700 years, especially when you consider that the people who spoke this language were situated between 2 powerful civilizations, the Etruscans to the north and the Romans to the south. So how did the Faliscans remain independent and keep their language for as long as they did? Gabriel Bacum argues that the Faliscans must have been a pretty wealthy society. We know they had good access to trade routes, they had fertile land, and they may have exported goods like pottery and cattle and linen. But eventually the pressure of existing between these 2 powerful societies, the Etruscans and the Romans, was too much, and the Faliscans eventually fell to the Romans. And about 100 years later, their language disappeared as well. Lucky for us though, their language is preserved in texts. And I'm going to go through 2 quick ones to give you a feel for how this language would have looked and sounded. A great example of a funerary text comes from the 3rd century Tomba dei Velminei. The text reads, "Tito Velmineo Titoi fe cupa," and this translates to Titus Velmineus, son of Titus, made the tomb. And what I want to do here is put a Latin translation side by side with the Faliscan text and give you a feel for how similar Latin and Faliscan would have been. So in Latin, this text would have translated to something like Titus Velmineus Titi fecit cupam. And in this chart here, we have the Faliscan and the Latin side by side along with the function that each one of these words plays in the sentence. So Tito is a personal name, Titus. Velmineo is the last name of this person. And then Titoi is a great example of the genitive case in Faliscan. Titoi means of Titus. So Tito Velmineo was also the son of a man named Titus. And then most scholars interpret fe to be the past tense or the perfect form of the verb to make, And kupa can mean a container or a tomb, and in this context it refers to a tomb. And if you look at those Latin words next to it, you see how similar the languages are. Our second text is one of the most famous Faliscan texts that we have, and it comes from that 4th century kylix, or drinking bowl, that I told you about at the beginning of the episode. The text reads, Foied vino pipafo kra karefo. And what this translates to is, today I will drink wine, tomorrow I will go without, or tomorrow I will lack. So again, I want to put this text side by side with the Latin translation. In Latin, the text would read, Odie vinum bibam cras carebo. And on display in this phrase, we have some classic Faliscan features. We have the preserved word initial F, where in Latin we have an H. Although this F may not have been pronounced in Middle and Late Faliscan, but was preserved in writing as a kind of conservative orthographic convention. We also see that labial future that I talked about, the B or the F sound used to form the future in Latin and Faliscan respectively. There is much, much more that could be said about Faliscan, this fascinating sister language of Latin, but I'm going to stop here and recommend that you check out the sources in the description of this video if you want to do some further reading. And I'd like to remind you all too that if you want to learn to speak a foreign language, you can book a one-on-one lesson with the teacher of your choice on ITALKI, and you can sign up for free and get $10 off your first lesson using the link down in my description. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you want to support my work, and we'll see you next time.